Alright, so Escape from Tarkov is one of the most demanding and brutal games to run on PC. The RTX 4090 is currently the second most powerful consumer GPU available, sitting just behind the new 5090, and with all that power comes a hefty price tag. But is it really worth spending the cost of an entire high-end PC build on a GPU like the 4090 or 5090 for a game that's heavily CPU bound? Or can you get nearly the same performance from something a couple tiers lower, like the 5070Ti? In this video, I'll compare both cards head-to-head to find out if the 4090 offers a meaningful performance advantage in Tarkov, or if something like the 5070Ti is all you really need. With that being said, let's get right into it. For this test, I was running my Ryzen 7 9800 by 3D tuned with a plus 200 MHz boost clock override and a minus 40 undervolt. To get the most out of the chip, it's paired with 64 GB of DDR5 at 6000 CL30 with Titan secondary and tertiary timings. If you want all the tuning details on the system, check out the link in the upper right-hand corner. Storage is handled by a Gen 5 Aorus 10,000 square meters, and everything is running on a Gigabyte X670 Aorus Xtreme motherboard. The 5070Ti is an MSI Shadow 3X overclocked model, and the 4090 is an MSI Gaming Trio. As for the game settings, I used my Pure 80 optimized preset, which is my high texture preset for the best visuals-to-FPS ratio. If you want to see a full breakdown on those settings, check out the video in the upper right-hand corner. Each test was run 3 times per resolution, 1080p, 1440, and 4K. First off, plan to get baseline numbers without server and network variables, then online in live raids. I then take those averages and compare those numbers at 1080p on streets in offline mode. The 4090 averaged 183 FPS, just a 5% uplift from the 5070Ti to 174. The 1% lows were extremely close, 141 on the 4090 and 138 on the Ti. The 0.1% lows only differed by 3 of FPS, and overall performance was nearly identical here, with minimal gains for the 4090 and 1440. The 4090 averaged 174 of the 6% improvement over the 5070Ti's 164 for the 1%. Lows improved slightly, up 134 to 140, and the 0.1% lows rose from 117 to 129. A 10% difference, modest but measurable performance advantage there. Moving up to 4000 offline, the 4090 pulls ahead a bit more, with the 171 FPS average about a percent faster than the 5070Ti 158. So the 5070Ti is actually pretty impressive in 4K here. The 1% lows increased from 129 to 136, and 0.1% lows went up about 8%. Not nearly as dramatic gains as I expected in 4K. But I guess Streets is that heavily CPU bound even in offline with no bots in Streets Online 1080. The gap shrinks even more. The 4090 averaged 145 FPS, only 1 FPS ahead of the 5070Ti. The 1% lows came in at 115 versus 113, and the 4.1% lows were 99 versus 95, all within a 4% range. You're unlikely to notice any real difference between the two cars in this scenario. Streets Online 1440. The performance differences remain pretty subtle. The 4090 averaged 144, compared to 141 on the 5070Ti. That's only a 2% gain. The 1% and 0.1% lows were almost identical as well. Overall, gameplay felt very similar between both cards. In Straights 4K Online, the 4090 maintains its lead with the 144 FPS average, compared to 139 on the 5070Ti. The 1% lows came in at 111 versus 104, and 0.1% lows were 75 versus 67, about a 10% difference on the lows. The smoother lows here are the most meaningful difference between the two, in my opinion. In Customs Offline, in 1080, the 4090 averaged around 345 FPS, so only a minor 3% improvement over the 5070Ti at 335. The 1% lows were 234 versus 223 and the 0.1% lows were 196 versus 185. Again, small differences that don't feel much different in practice, even though the numbers are a little different in 1440 offline. The 4090 averaged 307 FPS, 14% faster than the 5070Ti is 269. Interestingly, the 5070Ti had a slightly 1% lower 191 versus the 4090's 186, likely due to the run variance. But interesting to note, the 0.1% lows were higher on the 4090, the 184 versus 178. In Customs 4K Offline, the 4090 showed its largest advantage, yet it had 210 FPS on average, a massive 52% increase over the 5070Ti's 138 1%. Lows were 171 versus 119, and 0.1% lows were 138 versus 114. These differences were clearly noticeable and point to a major uplift in performance on Customs, as opposed to Streets where the difference wasn't as large in Customs Online. And 1080 the 4090 averaged 211 FPS, compared to 203 on the 5070Ti. It's a 4% increase, 1% and 0.1% lows also rose slightly by around 5 to 7%. So both PUS delivered extremely high frame rates and the gameplay felt nearly identical. In 1440 online, both cards again performed similarly. The 4090 reached 201, while the 5070T managed 198, a marginal 2% difference. The 1% and 0.1% lows also differed by just 2 to 3 FPS, making the experience feel almost the same online. In 4K, the gap is significant. The 4090 averaged 174 FPS, compared to 138 on the 5070T, giving it a 26% edge. The 1% lows were 128 versus 119, and the 0.1% lows came in at 118 versus 106. These gains translated into the most meaningful difference I've seen between the two cards during the entire testing period. Throughout testing, the 4090 averaged around 245 west of power draw, compared to about 218 on the 5070T. I ran both GPUs on the default fan cards, and despite the higher power consumption, the 4090 actually ran slightly cooler, averaging around 50 degrees versus 61 on the 5070T. Both cards remained quiet during operation and comfortably cool, so the RTX 4090 really worth it for a talk-focused build. In my opinion, it's massive overkill. If Tarkov is your main game, the 5070T already hits the game's ceiling at 1440 with high textures and even in 4K with DLSS, which currently looks better than native rendering with TE. By the way, unless you're absolutely set on playing Tarkov and native 4000 at max fidelity for some reason, because like I said, DLSS for looks better than native, or you also play other graphically demanding titles or do heavy creative or editing work, the 4090 just doesn't make much sense here. For most people, the 5070T gives you about 85 to 90% of the performance for less than half the price. For most people, that money is going to be better spent on a stronger CPU, faster RAM, or upgrading your monitor, keyboard and mouse, all of which can have a bigger impact on your experience in Tarkov. Alright, that's all I got for this one. I hope it helped. If you found it useful, please drop a like, subscribe and hit the bell to stay updated with future hardware comparisons. It really helps support the channel and helps me keep making content for you. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.